Hello, my name is Stephen Reppert. I'm professor of neurobiology at the University of Massachusetts Medical School. And what I'm going to be talking about uh, is the neurobiology of the spectacular migration of the Eastern North American monarch butterfly. Now I'm giving two talks, and this talk is going to really focus on the overview of the migration to provide uh, you with an idea of the biology that we're dealing with and a little bit about what I'm going to be covering in much greater detail in my second talk, which will be focused on the time-compensated sun compass, which is the major orientation or navigational mechanism the butterflies use to migrate to their overwintering sites. And this will focus on both two major aspects that I'll discuss in detail, an actual structure in the brain that we know is the sun compass and the circadian clocks that are involved in this process. Now, this is a cartoon of North America. And there are two populations of monarch butterflies in North America. And the demarcation line is really the Rocky Mountains. And so we have the western population, west of the Rocky Mountains. Those butterflies undergo a much more truncated migration. They migrate in the fall to the Pacific coast. There's far fewer butterflies. And so we focus on the Eastern North American population because those butterflies undergo much more spectacular biology. And as a biologist, we're always looking for exaggerated biological systems because they help us in our understanding of mechanisms. So what is shown in the shaded area is where between the middle of August and the end of September, one has close to, on a good year, close to half a billion monarch butterflies that have freshly emerged from their chrysalises and are in the migratory state. Now, there are three aspects of that migratory state I want you to keep in mind. One is these butterflies' reproductive system is shut off. They have no interest in sex. They have a long distance to travel. So the butterflies are in reproductive diapause. What is hormonally coupled to that is the butterflies live a long time. They can live up to 9 months compared to their spring and summer counterparts that just live a few weeks. And third, the thing that we're really most interested in as neurobiologists is the butterflies have this incredible urge to fly south. And we exploit that to try to understand their navigational or orientation mechanisms. So this is actually an animation. And when I started on the click, we will go through a complete annual cycle of the migration and talk you through that. So we'll start the butterflies flapping their wings, okay? And now they begin their migration, migrating south. They only migrate by day. It can take them up to 2 months to travel distances close to 2,500 miles to ultimately get to their overwintering site, where they are until the weather warms in the spring, when there's massive reproduction on site. And then what's important are the females, because they're carrying fertile eggs, and they migrate partway back and oviposit those eggs on freshly emerged milkweed plant, the obligate food source, the larva. This then gives rise to at least a subsequent 2 generations of reproductively competent, short-lived spring and summer butterflies. And that those generations then repopulate the northern range of the Eastern North American population. So a couple of things about this migration cycle. It's multi-generational. And the other thing is the butterflies that do the bulk of the migrating are the ones that start out In the fall, in the northern part of their range, travel this long distance south, and then once they're there, actually flip around and go partway back. And those migrants are the ones that we study, particularly the migration south. Now let me tell you a little bit about the overwintering sites in Mexico, because they're pretty spectacular, and I think this is a very interesting story. So this is a satellite image of Mexico, and what you can see in this orange box is a region of about 300 square miles where all these butterflies, can be up to 1 billion butterflies, actually overwinter. So I'm going to blow up this box, and what we now see is within this box the 12 main regions where the monarch butterflies usually overwinter. This area is just west of Mexico City. It's on the top. These butterflies are in huge roosts by the thousands, millions, clustered together in a pine forest on top of the transvolcanic mountain range in this region, and they're right at the top of the mountains on the ridge. So they're about 2 miles up. So this is a very interesting image that was taken by Lincoln Brower. Lincoln Brower, who's one of the preeminent biologists who has studied monarch butterfly migration for really decades. And this photograph shows the pine forest. We can see the greenness of the pine trees, but then in the center, what we can see is this very intense orangish color. And that's because that's the reflection of the orange color of the monarch butterfly wings off about 1 million individuals. So let's now go to ground level, and what one finds is this: spectacular. You find these butterflies, branches like this one, that are just covered with thousands of butterflies. And the trees, limbs, not only the limbs, but the trunks, are really, really an amazing sight. Now, I want to tell you a story about how the overwintering sites were discovered, because I think it's really interesting in a number of ways. And the central character in this story is a zoologist, Fred Urquhart, and his wife Nora, who studied for 40 years the migration of the monarch butterfly, which eventually led to the discovery of the overwintering sites. That discovery, which I'll show in a few moments, was not until the mid-1970s. So we'd already put a man on the moon, but we didn't know where 1 billion butterflies actually overwintered. So as the Urquharts were studying the migration, they perfected, Professor Urquhart perfected this tagging strategy, which was to place a tag on butterflies that had an identification mark, and it was placed on butterflies. He perfected this in such a way that it didn't interfere at all with the butterfly's ability to fly. This has been perfected over the years, and tagging studies are still being done by hundreds of citizen scientists and school children, which I'll mention in a moment. Now, around the early 1950s, Professor Urquhart published a series of articles in magazines to try to get the general public interested in the monarch butterfly migration. And so he elicited the help of literally hundreds and thousands of individuals across the United States. School children were also recruited to take part in this activity. And let me just say that the monarch butterfly not only has this spectacular migratory biology that we need to understand, but the monarch butterfly is an incredible educator, because there have been many young minds that have been turned on to the monarch butterfly, or to science, by studying the biology of the monarch butterfly, helping tag when they were in school, for example, and these sorts of activities. So anyway, this tagging program, 25 years later, led eventually to the discovery of the overwintering site, which is in 1975. And it was by a husband and wife team, the Bruggers, Ken and Karen. And they had traveled for a few years through central Mexico, and they noticed areas where there were huge numbers of butterflies flying overhead, but did not come upon the overwintering site until January of 1975. They discovered this site and were awestruck by what they saw. They then reported this back to the Urquharts, and the Urquharts then made the journey the next year to Mexico, and then they were in their 60s, made this trek up 2 miles to this mountain top of this mountain where this major overwintering site was, to see this forest of butterflies. And they were awestruck, as the Bruggers were, and Fred Urquhart wrote an article then, and this finding was not published in Science, Cell, or Nature. It was published in National Geographic, the discovery of the overwintering sites, the pronouncement of this discovery to the outside world, and I think very appropriately so, because National Geographic had funded the Urquhart's efforts for many, many years. So this is a very iconic cover of the August 1976 issue of National Geographic, and shows Karen Brugger, butterflies around her, on her, and we can see that she is between two large pine trees whose trunks are just covered with literally thousands of butterflies. But that's not all of the story. Here's Fred Urquhart. He arrives at this overwintering site, and as he recalls in this article in National Geographic, he's walking through this forest of butterflies, seeing all this color, all this beauty, and all of a sudden, as he and his wife are walking through this area, a tree limb laden with butterflies falls to the forest floor. He looks down and he sees one of the butterflies that has one of his tags. And when he took this and actually looked at the tag and looked at his records, he found out that this butterfly originated in central Minnesota. So he brought it full circle. Not only was this a major overwintering site of monarch butterflies, but a major overwintering site of the Eastern North American monarch butterfly. Now, the monarch migration is actually threatened. There have been a number of articles, for example, the New York Times, other newspapers and magazines that have discussed this marked decrease in the number of migratory butterflies. And this is actually shown on this bar graph, which represents the yearly estimation by the World Wildlife Fund of the number of monarch butterflies that are actually collectively at all the overwintering sites. And this is a 20-year record, and we can see that the peak, for example, was really in 1996, 97, when there were close to, if you make the appropriate calculation, close to 1 billion butterflies at the overwintering site. But now we can see how things have decreased over the years, fluctuation, but really we're left with a situation now where the butterflies are still at very low numbers. In fact, the orange bar shows what the count was this past spring, and we can see that the number of butterflies on that orange bar is markedly less than has ever been recorded, at least over these 20 years. So we're talking about the estimate there of close to 50 million butterflies rather than at the peak close to 1 billion. So it's almost a 20-fold decrease from the peak is what has been found recently. Now, what are the factors that are threatening the migration? Well, there's 3 major factors that have been talked about. One is climate change, and clearly that was apparent, at least climate issues were apparent this past spring, the spring of 2013, in which monarch butterflies, females coming out of Mexico, remigrating to the southern U.S., were sort of held up because there was a cold front in the southern U.S., which was also inhibiting milkweed from germinating and beginning to come up. And that desynchrony between the plants and the butterflies substantially decreased the number of females who could actually oviposit on milkweed in that area and ultimately build up the mass of butterflies in subsequent generations. So that's just an example of how climate change can have an effect. The other issue, which has gotten a lot of discussion recently also, is genetically modified crops. Now, the major flight way of the monarch butterfly is in the Midwest, and their crops, primarily soybean and corn, the seeds that are planted are for the large part, are of genetically modified crops. So as these crops grow and develop, they are modified in such a way that they are resistant to herbicides. And so farmers can go in the Midwest, they can spray their fields, they get huge yields of crops, but they're killing off the wildflowers, which is important for pollinators like bees, and they're killing off milkweed, the primary food source of the monarch larva. Now, one of the individuals whose website I will mention, Chip Taylor, has been very instrumental in publicizing this problem and actually getting individuals all over the U.S. to plant milkweed in their gardens. And if you go to his website, which I'll talk about in a moment, and you can contact him, he will send you the appropriate seeds for the appropriate milkweed depending on where you're at. And the idea is that there are way stations that are being propagated, and these way stations are really people's gardens that now have milkweed so that the monarch larva can continue to propagate the population. The third issue is deforestation at the overwintering site. This has been a problem since the discovery of these sites to the outside world, and that's because logging is a major industry for the people who live and work in the overwintering region. The Mexican government has put restrictions on logging in this area. Obviously, we don't want to destroy this incredible habitat, which is very special for overwintering butterflies. And that has been I think, decreased to some extent. But again, all of these issues, being aware of them is important. I personally think there will always be the monarch butterfly migration of the Eastern North American population. And what will happen over the years is that hopefully the number of butterflies will come back to what we're used to seeing or have seen in the past. Now, I need to mention something that is very important in terms of this migration being threatened. It's not the monarch butterfly that is endangered. Monarch butterflies are worldwide. And wherever there's milkweed plant, monarchs will thrive. It's the phenomenon, this wonderful, incredible biology of the migration of the Eastern North American population. That's what's being threatened. Now, the butterflies have a long distance to travel. And it's important to realize, looking at these major flight ways, that these butterflies that undergo this journey every fall are at least 2 generations removed from the butterflies that were there before. So clearly there's a genetic program that is turned on in the migrants that leads to this really remarkable behavior. Now, my lab has really been interested the past decade in trying to understand really the mechanisms the butterfly uses to take the trip from their northern part of their range to fly south to get to their overwintering sites. Now, when biologists talk about long-distance migration and what animals need as a toolkit, they usually talk about 2 things. And one is a map, some sort of map sense. And that, by a map sense, I mean that a migrating animal knows where it is at any point along its destination relative to its destination. There are very few animals where a true map sense has actually been demonstrated. One example is in migrating sea turtles. For the monarch butterfly, there is no evidence yet that they have an actual map sense. But migrants also exploit compasses. And compasses use stable environmental factors that can provide guideposts for a migrating animal such as the monarch butterfly to provide directionality over the course of the day and throughout the duration of the migration. So compasses are used for directionality. And what there's been a lot of work on, and I think everybody agrees, the major compass system the butterflies use to fly south is what's called a time-compensated sun compass, which is shown in this animation. And it's a system basically where the circadian clock compensates for the movement of the sun, which is providing directional cues to the butterfly while still allowing the butterfly to maintain a fixed southerly flight direction. And again, that will be the focus of the second talk that I give on the monarch butterfly. So here's sort of a monarch butterfly and all the questions that we need to think about in very simple form. When do the butterflies begin their journey? They need to have some idea where Mexico is, know where and when to stop. Some of these, like how they begin the journey, we have some evidence as to how that occurs, which I'll talk about in my second presentation. But there are a lot of these questions we still don't know the answer to. But really what is getting the butterflies from starting their journey to the end of their journey are the navigation or orientation mechanisms that we have really spent a lot of time trying to understand. So here are the major resources that I just wanted to mention. There are many resources out there. These are just examples. Monarch Watch, which is run by Chip Taylor at the University of Kansas. And he still has continued the tagging studies of the Urquharts. It's a wonderful education resource that he runs. He gets teachers and kids interested in tagging butterflies. He also is responsible for this way station idea. And again, if you just put in Google Monarch Watch, his site will come up and provide a lot of information about what he's up to and how you can help in terms of planting milkweed. Journey North is from the Annenberg Center, run by the Annenberg Center. It's a really great resource also. They give a real-time output of the actual migratory behavior of the butterfly. So individuals throughout the U.S. Write in or email the people at the Annenberg Center. And so you get a real-time idea of the actual day-to-day movement of the butterflies, again, south to Mexico and the remigration partway back. Monarch Lab, which is run by Karen Oberhauser, again, is a great educational resource. She does a lot of outreach to teachers and lay scientists. And then my laboratory, if you Google Reppert Lab, you will find what we're up to, not only what I've just briefly mentioned in this talk, but what I will be talking about in my second presentation, and which is focused more on the underlying biology of the butterfly, the questions that we've tried to ask, some of the answers we've gotten, and what the sort of future is in our eyes, in terms of where we need to go. So with that, I will end my first presentation, and I want to thank you for your time and attention.